Hello, my name is Stephen Holm, and I am with HomeGrounds, a place where you go to learn more about brewing and enjoying better quality coffee right at home. And today we're talking about the brand new release of the Baratza Encore ESP. This is Baratza's answer to those of you looking for a grinder that can do both drip and espresso at a very affordable price point. It's adding on to their current grinder, the Baratza Encore, which has been around for years. It's been a very reliable and fantastic grinder at a great price point. And they've added the ESP that adds some espresso functionality that we'll talk about here in a little bit. Now, right up front, I want to mention a word on transparency that a few months ago, Baratza reached out to me. They wanted to send me a grinder to try out and give them my thoughts and possibly make a video on it if I was interested. There was no stipulation that I needed to make a fantastic review about it or anything. I could do whatever I wanted. And honestly, I've been wanting to review this grinder for a year since I first heard about it, so I was excited for the opportunity. But just so you know that this grinder was sent to me for free from Baratza. Now, I also want to mention before we hop into the review that I'm going to be making quite a few videos over the next week featuring this grinder, both comparing it to other grinders that are already out there, like the Baratza Sette, and then also a grinder that's about to come out that you are probably well aware of. But just so you know that there will be more in-depth testing coming shortly. This video is mainly going to focus on the main features and how this grinder performs on its own. So let's hop right into the first impressions. It looks pretty similar to the original Encore, as you can see over here. The original Encore has gone through a few different visual iterations, so I'm not even sure what they look like as of now, but at least this one, it says Encore on the front, whereas the ESP says Baratza. Not a big thing. On the side here, if we look at these switches, they're a little bit different. Not a whole lot going on there. Really, the biggest thing that you can see is on the adjustment collar up here, we have these 20 settings labeled espresso. And that's really where this grinder gets interesting. We'll talk more about those here in a little bit. Now, another really cool thing that they added is that since this grinder can be used for espresso, we have this additional dosing cup here. So instead of always having to use the larger dosing cup, we can take this plastic piece, insert it into here. Now we have a dosing cup that we can go directly into there, and from this cup into your portafilter. It can fit either 58mm or 54mm portafilters, so it is nice and versatile there, and it works really well. I like it. It's anti-static, so no worries about any static with your espresso. Now, one of the other big differences between these two grinders is the burrs that they are using. So they each have 40mm conical steel burrs, but the ESP uses an M2 burr set, whereas the Encore original uses an M3. The M2s are used in a few other grinders from Baratza, but they are said to have a sharper and steeper cutting surface, allowing for a more uniform grind with less fines. So they're more designed for, say, espresso. And I found that they did perform a lot better than the M3 burrs, which we will get into later. I also want to mention that the grinder does include a couple shims that you can put in the burrs in case you're not grinding fine enough as you would like. So you would just take it apart, add these between the two burrs, and you'd have a little more fineness to it. I didn't find that I needed this, but maybe over time, if you are finding that your grinder isn't grinding fine enough, you can throw these in there. And all of this can be had for $200, which the original Encore, I believe, is $165, although it's been on sale a lot recently. But for $200 to have a grinder that does espresso and drip is a killer deal as long as it actually performs. And so let's hop into that. First, let's look at the noise that this grinder produces. So I have a decibel meter right here. Let's run it next to each grinder and see how loud they are, and then we'll throw some beans in as well. So the original Encore. And the ESP. Now I'll grab some coffee. The original Encore. Now the ESP. So it looked like between the two of those, the ESP was a little bit louder. They're both on the same grind setting, at least showing on the grinder, of right in the middle at 20. And so this was... And so the ESP looked like it was maxing out around 92 decibels, whereas the original Encore was 88. Now, I've never had any issues with this grinder being too loud around the house. I don't think many people would, but at least now you have a reference for how loud it is. All right, so now let's talk about how this grinder performs for espresso, because that's going to be its main selling point. And what Baratza did is really interesting. They took the original Encore and they took the finest half of the settings, so 0 through 20 out of the 40 settings on here, and they made them span a smaller range. So I'll throw up some graphs here, and what those are showing are the average particle size of the grounds at each grind setting throughout the grinder. And if you look, I'll show on the original Encore, and you can see that it gradually increases at a pretty linear rate as you increase the grind size. Whereas with the ESP on the first half of the grind settings, it's actually not increasing as much. And then once you get past 20, it shoots up until it matches the Encore at the coarsest setting. So what that means is that in the espresso range, in that 0 to 20 range, you have a lot more adjustability, so you're better able to dial in a coffee for espresso when it's needed. But then once you get past that 20, you have less adjustability. So each little click is going to be spanning a wider grind coarseness versus the original Encore. So they are somewhat sacrificing the drip adjustability in this grinder in order to get more adjustability within the espresso range. And I think it worked out really well, because now I'm going to pull some espressos and we're going to talk about how it works when you're making espresso, show you sort of the workflow that I use and how it tastes. So I've got a coffee here from Brandywine Coffee Roasters. We're gonna dial in an espresso. I'm gonna do it live on camera for you here. I haven't had it yet. We'll start around the setting 5 on the grinder with a 20-gram dose, around a 40-gram yield, and aiming for about 30 seconds. As for retention in this grinder, I haven't experienced that much. There is a little bit because there's no bellows or anything to push air through the burrs to get out every little last bit. So I usually grind about 0.3 to 0.4 extra grams, and that usually ends up being good. So I've weighed out 20.4 grams here. I'm not gonna do any RDT, so spraying any water in there to get rid of static, because I don't really find much static with this grinder, which is another big plus. So you can see how long that took to grind 20 grams of coffee. Now out here I have 19.9 grams, so pretty good. We lost about half a gram in there. I'm sure if I was to put it under here, pulse it a little bit, and maybe even do a little knock knock. Now we have 20 grams, so perfect. I will say that the grinds that come out of this grinder are fairly clumpy. So we have a lot of big clumps in here, and that is pretty typical with grinders. And all you need to do to get rid of that is dump your grounds into your portafilter and then use some sort of WDT tool. But then you just run that through here. You're getting rid of all those clumps. And I pretty much recommend doing this with any espresso grinder. There aren't many out there, at least for home use, that won't be super clumpy. Like I said, I'm gonna aim for a 40-gram yield, hopefully get it in about 30 seconds. So I can tell right away we're already at 22 seconds and we're just starting to get the first drops. So this was ground a little bit too fine, and that's good. It shows that we're at setting 5 on the grinder. I can stop right there. We are still plenty fine enough, so I can roll that back. I'm gonna go around 4 or more clicks, so we're right at 9, and we'll see how that goes here. Still a pretty slow shot here, so probably still a little bit fine, but I'm gonna let this go until we reach our 40 gram yield, so then I can show you adjusting on here how many clicks is equal to about how many seconds. That's not gonna be totally exact, just so you can get a sense of how much adjustability we have in this espresso range. Right, so that took 1 minute and 10 seconds. For a 40 gram yield. The shot itself looks really nice, no major channeling or anything. So now I'm gonna pull another shot. I'm gonna adjust it back another 4 clicks. So now we're at 13 on there, and do the exact same thing and see how many seconds that takes off our shot. So that was a 40 gram yield in 45 seconds. So 4 clicks took off 25 seconds. So we can average that about each click is a 6-second adjustment in our grind time, which I think is pretty good. I'm gonna give this shot a taste. I can tell you how it tastes and my overall impressions of the shots that I'm getting from this grinder. Taste-wise, this shot is pretty similar to most coffees that I've been getting making espresso with this grinder. Very sweet, very rich, very syrupy. As an espresso grinder, I've been really enjoying it. I haven't had any issues whatsoever, and I can't imagine many coming along down the road. Now let's move on from talking about it as an espresso grinder to also using it as a drip grinder, because it is not just an espresso grinder, it is an espresso-focused grinder that also has the ability to grind for drip. And I still think that it is a fairly decent drip grinder for the price. The original Encore was very hard to beat at its price point. It's a fantastic drip grinder, and technically this grinder can still do all of those things. However, because of these micro settings in the espresso range, you lose a lot of adjustability past there. You can still make pretty much any brew method with this grinder. You will just have less adjustability to, say, dial in a coffee with a pour over method than you would with the original Encore, or than you would with most other grinders in this price point. So after talking about all of these things about the Baratza Encore ESP, what are some things that we love about it as a grinder? First off, at the price point of right around $200, getting a grinder focused for espresso like this is very hard to find, and one that is this high quality, and you're also getting some adjustability as far as using it as a drip grinder is phenomenal. They really did a great job making this an espresso focused grinder that can also do drip settings. The other great thing we love about this grinder is that it's made by Baratza. Baratza has been around for a long time, and in my opinion, they make some of the best grinders designed for home consumers out there. They have a philosophy that their grinders should be able to be serviced and last forever. So all the parts in here, you're able to buy replacements, and that is a huge plus. A lot of grinders out there that are trying to do this whole espresso to drip thing, they may be able to get good results, but if anything fails in that grinder, you will have a hard time trying to fix it, whereas Baratza is there, their customer support is great. I can't recommend them enough. So what are my final thoughts on the Encore ESP? I think that this is a fantastic grinder that Baratza has put out for someone looking for a grinder that can do mostly espresso, but also the occasional drip coffee. Say if you're making a big pot on the weekends, but throughout the week you're just making shots of espresso, this is the perfect grinder for you. And at only $200, that is quite a steal, and I would recommend this grinder to pretty much anyone that is looking for an espresso focused grinder. If you have any additional questions, comments, concerns, anything, let me know in the comments down below. This grinder is available as of today at a retailer near you, so check out the Baratza website and where to find one. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy brewing.